Close your eyes and imagine a world where the simple act of walking down your street becomes an exercise in survival, where the familiar sounds of your neighborhood, children's laughter, vendors calling their wares, the gentle hum of daily commerce have been replaced by the sharp crack of boots on cobblestone and the distant rumble of military vehicles. This is the world we're about to explore together, a world that existed not in some distant medieval past, but less than a century ago, in the heart of Europe. Tonight, we'll walk through the streets of Nazi-occupied Poland, a place where ordinary people, teachers, bakers, students, mothers, found themselves living under conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance and dignity. We'll discover how they adapted, how they resisted, and how they preserved their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Through their stories, we'll understand not just what happened, but what it felt like to live through one of history's darkest chapters. Our journey will take us first through the narrow streets and crowded apartments of Warsaw, where families learn to navigate a world of curfews, ration cards, and constant surveillance. We'll then witness one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in human history, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. From there, we'll uncover the remarkable story of the Wunsch Shabbat Archive, where ordinary people risked everything to document their experiences for future generations. Finally, we'll glimpse the stark contrast between the suffering below and the comfort above, as Nazi officers dined on balconies overlooking the ruins of destroyed communities. Let yourself settle in as we step back in time, remembering that understanding the past helps us appreciate the freedoms and securities we often take for granted today. The stories we're about to explore are difficult, but they're also testaments to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Take a deep breath and let's begin this journey through history together. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. Picture yourself waking in a small Warsaw apartment in the winter of 1941. The room is cold, bitterly cold, because coal is scarce and what little fuel exists must be rationed carefully. You can see your breath in the dim morning light, filtering through windows that may be cracked or covered with paper where glass once was. The radiator has been silent for months now, and the wooden floors beneath your feet feel like ice against your skin. This is how hundreds of thousands of Warsaw residents began each day during the occupation, not with the comfort of warmth, but with the sharp reminder that even basic necessities were no longer guaranteed. The apartment itself tells a story of gradual loss. Furniture has been sold piece by piece to buy food on the black market. The family photographs still hang on the walls, but they're reminders of relatives who may have disappeared, been deported, or simply vanished into the chaos of war. The kitchen, once the heart of family life, now contains only the most essential items. Pots and pans have been requisitioned by the occupying forces, along with anything made of copper or brass. What remains are a few chipped plates, some worn utensils, and perhaps a small pot for cooking whatever meager rations can be obtained. You dress quickly in layers, not for fashion, but for survival. Clothing, like everything else, has become precious. New items are impossible to find, and what exists must be mended again and again until it's more patch than original fabric. Your coat, if you're fortunate enough to have one, may be threadbare, but is essential for the long walks ahead. Public transportation is unreliable and expensive, and many prefer to walk rather than risk the crowded trams where diseases spread easily and German soldiers might demand papers at any moment. Before leaving the apartment, you check your identification papers carefully. These documents have become more important than money. Without them, you cannot move freely, cannot work, cannot even exist legally in this new reality. The papers must be carried at all times, kept clean and undamaged, because a torn or illegible document could mean immediate arrest. Fold them carefully and place them in an inner pocket close to your body, where they'll stay warm and dry. This simple act Checking your papers has become as routine as brushing your teeth. Yet it carries the weight of life and death. The stairwell of your apartment building is dark and smells of damp wood and unwashed bodies. The electricity is intermittent at best, and the building's heating system failed long ago. As you descend, you might pass neighbors, people you've known for years, but conversations are brief and careful. Walls have ears in occupied Warsaw, and even longtime friends might be informants, either willingly or under coercion. The elderly woman from the second floor, who once shared gossip about the neighborhood, now averts her eyes. The young man from upstairs, who used to help carry groceries, now keeps his head down and hurries past. Trust, like warmth and food, has become a luxury few can afford. Stepping onto the street is like entering a different world entirely. It's the Warsaw you once knew. Vibrant, bustling, alive with commerce and culture, has been transformed into something resembling a prison compound. German signage has replaced Polish street names, and new rules govern every aspect of public life. Sidewalks are divided now. Some sections are forbidden to Polish civilians, reserved only for German personnel. You learn to navigate these invisible boundaries, developing an almost supernatural awareness of which routes are safe and which might lead to confrontation. The streets themselves bear the scars of invasion and occupation. Bullet holes pockmark the walls of buildings, and some structures stand as hollow shells, their windows like empty eye sockets staring down at passersby. Debris from the 1939 siege still litters some corners, chunks of concrete, twisted metal, and fragments of what were once homes and shops. The city's attempt to clean and repair has been sporadic and half-hearted. The occupiers seem content to let Warsaw wear its wounds as a reminder of conquest. Walking through these streets, you become acutely aware of sound. Every footstep seems to echo. Every conversation feels too loud. The clip-clop of horse-drawn carts has largely replaced the hum of automobiles, as fuel is reserved for military use. When motor vehicles do pass, they're usually German military, trucks carrying soldiers, or occasionally the sleek black cars of high-ranking officials. These vehicles move through the city like sharks through water, and pedestrians instinctively step aside, pressing themselves against buildings to avoid any possibility of contact. Your destination might be a workplace, a market, or perhaps a queue for rations. Whatever the purpose, the journey is planned carefully. Certain streets are safer than others. Certain times of day less likely to result in random checks or conscription for forced labor. You've learned to read the city's moods when tensions are high, when searches are more frequent, when it's better to stay indoors entirely. This knowledge comes from bitter experience and whispered warnings passed between neighbors, friends, and strangers united by their shared vulnerability. The ration queue, when you reach it, is a study in quiet desperation. People stand in lines that sometimes stretch for blocks, waiting for hours to receive portions of bread, potatoes, or other basic foods. The amounts are calculated not for health or satisfaction, but for mere survival, just enough to keep people alive and able to work. The bread is often dark and gritty, mixed with sawdust or other fillers. The potatoes may be small and sprouting, but these items represent the difference between life and death. So they're received with gratitude despite their poor quality. Standing in these queues, you observe the subtle hierarchies that have emerged. Those with better connections or more money can sometimes purchase additional items on the black market, and their slightly better clothing or healthier appearance makes them stand out. Others are clearly struggling more severely. Their clothes are more patched, their faces more gaunt, their movements slower and more deliberate as they conserve energy. Children in these lines often seem older than their years, their eyes holding a wariness that speaks to experiences no child should have to endure. The interaction with German officials, when your turn comes, is conducted in careful silence. You present your ration card, receive your allocation, and move on quickly. Eye contact is minimal, words are few, and any expression of gratitude is muted. These transactions are businesslike and cold, stripped of the human warmth that once characterized neighborhood commerce. The officials themselves vary. Some are indifferent, processing people like inventory. Others show hints of sadism, enjoying the power they hold over basic human needs. Returning home with your rations, you navigate the same dangerous streets with a different kind of anxiety. Now you're carrying something valuable, food, which makes you a potential target for robbery. Desperate people sometimes resort to desperate measures, and even longtime neighbors might view your meager supplies with envious eyes. You walk quickly, but not too quickly, trying to appear confident without seeming to have anything worth taking. The small parcel of food in your bag represents not just today's meal, but hope for tomorrow's survival. The afternoon hours bring their own rhythms and dangers. This is when German patrols are most active, when random checks for identification papers are most frequent, when civilians might be conscripted for forced labor projects. The wise citizen of occupied Warsaw learns to recognize the signs: the sound of military vehicles slowing down, the sight of soldiers dismounting, the sudden emptying of streets as people disappear into doorways and side alleys. Those who can't escape quickly enough might find themselves spending days or weeks working on construction projects, clearing rubble, or performing other tasks for the occupying forces. As evening approaches, curfew begins to shape everyone's movements. The exact hours vary, but typically all civilians must be indoors well before full darkness falls. This means that social visits, if they happen at all, must be brief and carefully timed. Extended family members who once gathered regularly for dinner now see each other rarely, if at all. The simple pleasure of an evening walk, once a common way to end the day, has become impossible. Instead, people hurry through the streets with purpose, racing against the approaching deadline that will trap them in their apartments till dawn. The transition from day to night in occupied Warsaw is marked not by the gentle dimming of streetlights, but by the harsh finality of enforced darkness. Windows must be covered completely to prevent any light from escaping, a requirement that serves both military purposes and psychological ones. The city, once alive with nighttime activity, becomes a place of forced stillness and silence. In this darkness, families gather around small candles or oil lamps, conserving their meager supplies while trying to maintain some semblance of normal life. Inside these apartments, the evening hours reveal the true cost of occupation. Children do homework by candlelight, if they're attending school at all. Adults prepare clothing, plan the next day's activities, or simply sit in quiet conversation, always aware that their voices carry through thin walls to neighbors who may or may not be trustworthy. The radio, if one still exists and can be operated safely, becomes a precious connection to the outside world, though listening to foreign broadcasts is strictly forbidden and punishable by death. The night brings its own particular fears. Sleep is often fitful, interrupted by the sounds of boots on cobblestone, voices in the street, or the distant rumble of vehicles. Sometimes these sounds mean nothing, just routine patrols or officials passing through. But sometimes they herald arrests, deportations, or worse. Families learn to sleep lightly, always ready to hide valuables, destroy compromising documents, or simply hold each other close if the sounds stop at their building. This constant state of alertness takes its toll, leaving people exhausted even after a full night's rest. This was the rhythm of daily life in occupied Warsaw, a careful choreography of survival that required constant vigilance, careful planning, and enormous reserves of mental and physical strength. It was a life stripped of luxuries, comforts, and often basic dignities. Yet, it was life nonetheless. And in that simple fact, the stubborn persistence of human existence under the most difficult circumstances, we find the first glimmers of the resistance and resilience that would define the Polish experience during these dark years. As the months of occupation stretched into years, the geography of survival in Warsaw underwent a dramatic and sinister transformation. Imagine watching your city being carved up like pieces of a puzzle, with entire neighborhoods suddenly declared forbidden territory. By November 1940, the German authorities had completed the construction of what they euphemistically called a Jewish residential district. In reality, it's a massive prison encompassing barely 3 square miles of the city, surrounded by walls, 10 feet high and topped with barbed wire and broken glass. The process of creating this enclosed space was methodical and brutal in its efficiency. Streets that had once connected neighborhoods were suddenly bisected by brick walls that seemed to sprout from the ground overnight. Families who had lived in apartments just blocks apart found themselves separated by barriers that might as well have been continents. The construction itself was carried out by forced labor residents of the area, who were compelled to build their own cage under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Picture the morning when the walls were finally sealed, and movement between the ghetto and the rest of Warsaw became impossible without special permits. Imagine standing at one of those walls, perhaps at the intersection of Szladna and Żelazna streets, and realizing that the world had suddenly become much smaller. The sounds from the other side, traffic, voices, the ordinary bustle of city life seemed to come from another universe. Children would sometimes climb 2 upper-story windows just to catch glimpses of the forbidden world beyond the barriers, their faces pressed against glass as they watched life continue normally just a few hundred yards away. Inside this compressed space, nearly 500,000 people were forced to live in conditions that defied every principle of human dignity. Apartment buildings designed for single families now housed dozens of people. Rooms that had once been bedrooms, parlors, or studies were subdivided again and again, as blankets and wooden boards, creating the illusion of privacy where none could truly exist. The smell of too many bodies in too small a space became a constant presence, a mixture of unwashed clothing, cooking, food, sickness, and the particular odor of fear and desperation. The daily routine within the ghetto walls followed its own harsh rhythm, dictated by the need to survive in an environment designed for gradual extermination. Mornings began before dawn, not by choice, but by necessity. Sleep was often interrupted by the sounds of deportations, the dreaded roundups that could happen at any hour. Families learned to sleep fully clothed, with small bundles of essential belongings always within reach. The lucky ones had hiding places, false walls, concealed basements, or spaces in attics where they could disappear if the deportation teams came to their building. Food became an obsession that consumed virtually every waking thought. The official rations provided by the German authorities were calculated with scientific precision to be insufficient for survival, roughly 180 calories per day, compared to the 2,000 or more needed to maintain health. This meant that every meal was a careful negotiation with starvation. Bread was divided into portions so small that they could be consumed in a single bite. Yet these morsels were saved, treasured, and sometimes traded for other essential items like candles or soap. The black market that emerged within a ghetto was both a lifeline and a source of terrible moral complexity. Those with connections to the outside world through bribery, smuggling, or relationships with German officials could sometimes obtain additional food, medicine, or other necessities. But the prices were astronomical, payable only in jewelry, family heirlooms, or other valuables that represented generations of family history. Imagine having to choose between your grandmother's wedding ring and medicine for your sick child. These were the impossible decisions that people faced daily. Children developed their own economy of survival, becoming smugglers who could slip through gaps in the walls or sewage systems to bring food back to their families. These young people, some barely 10 years old, risked their lives daily to bring back a few potatoes or a loaf of bread. They moved through the city's underground spaces like shadows, learning routes that adults could never navigate, developing skills that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Yet their success often meant the difference between life and death for entire families. The streets of the ghetto themselves became stages for a constant drama of survival. Bodies of those who had died from starvation or disease were collected each morning, wrapped in paper because cloth was too valuable to waste on the dead. These daily processions became so common that people barely noticed them stepping around. The carts that carried away neighbors, friends, and family members. The sight of skeletal figures wrapped in newspaper being wheeled through streets where children still played when they could find the energy represented the complete breakdown of normal social order. Disease spread through the overcrowded quarters like wildfire through dry grass. Typhus, carried by lice that thrived in the unsanitary conditions, became endemic. The symptoms, high fever, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash were feared almost as much as starvation itself. Families with typhus victims faced an impossible choice: report the illness and risk deportation to unknown destinations, or hide the sick person and watch them suffer without medical care. Secret hospitals operated in basements and hidden rooms, staffed by doctors and nurses who continued their work despite having no supplies, no medicine, and little hope of actually healing their patients. The psychological toll of this compressed existence was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. Privacy, which most people take for granted, became a forgotten luxury. Personal hygiene, once a matter of routine self-care, became nearly impossible to maintain. The simple pleasure of a quiet moment alone, a private conversation, or even the ability to express emotions freely, all of these were casualties of the overcrowded conditions. Families that had once been close found themselves irritated by each other's constant presence, while strangers forced to share living spaces struggled to maintain basic civility. Yet even in these conditions, people found ways to preserve their humanity and dignity. Underground schools continued to operate, with teachers conducting lessons in whispered voices in hidden rooms. Children learned mathematics using pieces of bread as counting tools, and geography by drawing maps in the dust of basement floors. Libraries were created from books that people had managed to save, passed from family to family like precious treasures. These small acts of cultural preservation became forms of resistance, ways of maintaining identity and hope in the face of twat. Systematic dehumanization. Religious observance, too, continued in modified forms despite the risks and practical difficulties. Prayer services were held in secret, with participants taking turns as lookouts. Ritual objects that had been saved during the chaos of resettlement were shared among families, passed carefully from apartment to apartment for special occasions. The celebration of holidays became exercises in creative adaptation, finding ways to honor tradition while working within the constraints of poverty, overcrowding, and constant danger. The nights in the ghetto were filled with sounds that spoke to the compressed intensity of life within the walls. Through thin walls and open windows, you could hear everything: whispered conversations about escape plans, a quiet sobs of people grieving for lost family members, the scratch of pen on paper as someone tried to document their experiences, the shuffle of feet as people moved restlessly in spaces too small for proper rest. Sometimes there would be the sound of music, a violin played softly, or voices joined in a barely audible song that reminded everyone of better times. As winter approached, the challenge of staying warm became yet another battle for survival. Fuel was virtually impossible to obtain legally, so people burned whatever they could find: books, furniture, even pieces of the wooden structures that divided their living spaces. The irony of burning literature for warmth was not lost on the educated residents of the ghetto, but survival took precedence over sentiment. Families would gather around these makeshift fires, sharing body heat and what little food they had, creating small circles of human warmth in a world that seemed designed to freeze their bodies and souls. The transformation of Warsaw's residents. During these months of enclosed existence was visible in their faces, their posture, their movements. People who had once walked with confidence now moved carefully, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary attention. Clothing became looser as bodies adapted to near starvation. Conversations became more direct, stripped of social pleasantries that seemed frivolous in the face of immediate survival needs. Yet, paradoxically, the extreme nature of their shared experience also created bonds of solidarity that might never have existed in normal circumstances. This enclosed world within the walls was not just a place of suffering, though suffering was omnipresent. It was also a place where human ingenuity, creativity, and mutual support were constantly demonstrated. People found ways to create art from scraps, to maintain education without textbooks, to practice medicine without supplies, and to preserve hope without reasonable cause for optimism. These achievements, small as they might seem, represented victories of the human spirit over forces designed to crush it entirely. And it was within these walls, among these compressed and suffering people, that the seeds of one of history's most remarkable acts of resistance were being quietly planted. The word deportation in occupied Warsaw carried a weight that no translation can fully capture. It was whispered in corners, discussed in coded language, and feared with an intensity that made grown adults tremble like children. By the summer of 1942, the reality of what these deportations meant was becoming increasingly clear. Even as people clung to hope that their loved ones were truly being sent to work camps, as the German authorities claimed. The sound of trucks arriving in the early morning hours, the sharp commands in German, crying of children, these became the soundtrack of a community watching itself disappear, piece by piece. Imagine living in a world where every knock on the door might be your last moment in the only home you've known. The deportation process began with lists, endless lists compiled by German officials and their collaborators, containing names, addresses, and family compositions. These lists were created with bureaucratic precision, treating human lives like inventory to be processed and relocated. Families would hear rumors about whose names appeared on the next transport, leading to desperate attempts to hide, bribe officials, or simply disappear into the maze of overcrowded buildings and hidden spaces that had become their world. The actual process of deportation was designed to be swift and overwhelming, giving victims little time to think or resist. Trucks would arrive before dawn, accompanied by German soldiers and Jewish police who had been forced into collaboration. The orders were simple and non-negotiable. Families had 30 minutes to pack essential belongings and report to collection points. 30 minutes to gather the remnants of a lifetime, to decide which photographs to save, which pieces of clothing might be needed, which mementos of happier times could fit into a single bag. The cruelty of this time limit was both practical and psychological. It prevented organized resistance while forcing people to abandon almost everything that connected them to their former lives. Children during these deportation actions often understood more than adults realized. They had learned to read the subtle signs of approaching danger, the increased nervousness of their parents, the hurried conversations that stopped when they entered a room, the way adults' eyes darted constantly toward doors and windows. Some families had developed elaborate hiding systems, with children trained to crawl into specially constructed spaces behind walls or under floorboards at the first sign of trouble. These hiding places were cramped, airless spaces where families might remain motionless for hours, listening to the sounds of their neighbors being taken away. The collection points, usually large courtyards or squares within the ghetto, became scenes of barely controlled chaos as hundreds of people were processed for transport. Families clutched their meager belongings while officials checked names against lists, separated individuals into different groups, and loaded people onto trains that would carry them to unknown destinations. The elderly and sick were often unable to keep up with the pace demanded by their captors, leading to scenes of terrible desperation as family members tried to support loved ones who could barely walk. The trains themselves were cattle cars, windowless freight wagons designed for livestock, not human passengers. Into each car, the German authorities packed far more people than the space could reasonably accommodate. Bodies pressed against the bodies in the darkness with no room to sit down, no access to water or sanitation facilities, and no idea of their destination or the length of their journey. The smell inside these cars became overwhelming within hours, a combination of human waste, fear-induced perspiration, and the gradual onset of death among the weakest passengers. Children cried until they had no more tears, adults prayed, or simply stared into the darkness, and everyone struggled to breathe air that grew thinner and fouler with each passing mile. Those who remained behind after each deportation faced their own form of psychological torture. Walking through neighborhoods that had been half emptied overnight, they saw apartments with doors standing open, revealing the hasty abandonment of lives interrupted mid-sentence. Personal belongings lay scattered where they had been dropped during the frantic packing process. Children's toys, family photographs, half-finished meals that would never be completed. The silence in these emptied spaces was profound and eerie, broken only by the wind moving through abandoned rooms and the occasional sound of scavenging animals looking for food scraps. The survivors developed coping mechanisms that would have been unimaginable in normal circumstances. Some adopted a fatalistic acceptance, reasoning that resistance was futile and that their turn would come eventually, regardless of their actions. Others threw themselves into frantic activity, volunteering for work details, learning new skills, or trying to make themselves so useful that they might be spared. Still others retreated into an internal world of memories, spending hours each day mentally, reliving happier times as a form of escape from their present reality. Families that managed to avoid the early deportations found themselves living in a state of constant hypervigilance that took an enormous toll on their mental and physical health. Sleep became nearly impossible, as every sound in the night might signal the arrival of deportation teams. Meals were eaten quickly and with little conversation, as families needed to be ready to run or hide at any moment. Children lost their childhood innocence rapidly, learning to be silent when necessary, to hide when commanded, and to accept that their parents might disappear without warning or explanation. The Jewish Council was forced to collaborate in the deportation process by providing lists and organizing transports. It faced impossible moral choices that would haunt survivors for decades. Council members knew that cooperation meant sending their own people to probable death. Yet, refusal would likely result in their own execution and the appointment of even more compliant replacements. Some council members tried to protect certain individuals by removing names from transport lists or providing warnings about upcoming deportations. Others focused on trying to negotiate for better conditions or smaller numbers of deportees. All of them lived with the knowledge that their decisions directly affected who lived and who died. The economic impact of the deportations was immediate and devastating. Each family removed from the ghetto took with them whatever meager income they had been generating, whether through official work assignments or black market activities. The remaining population found themselves supporting an increasingly dysfunctional community where essential services were breaking down as the people who provided them disappeared. Doctors, teachers, skilled craftsmen, and community leaders were among those deported, leaving gaps in knowledge and leadership that could not easily be filled. Yet, even in the face of this systematic destruction, attacks of resistance and solidarity continued. Some families chose to remain together even when separation might have improved their individual chances of survival. Others took in orphaned children, despite having barely enough resources to support themselves. Underground networks continued to operate, sharing information about deportation plans and helping people hide or escape when possible. These acts of resistance were often small and largely symbolic, but they represented a refusal to accept complete dehumanization. The psychological adaptation required to survive in this environment of constant threat was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the deportation period. People learned to live in the present moment with an intensity that blocked out both past memories and future fears. Conversations became more meaningful, relationships more intense, and simple pleasures, a shared piece of bread, a brief moment of laughter, the sight of sunlight streaming through a window, more precious than any luxury from their former lives. Religious faith, for those who maintained it, took on new dimensions during this period. Traditional concepts of divine justice and protection seemed inadequate to explain their circumstances, leading some to abandon religious practice entirely, while others developed more complex theological frameworks that could accommodate suffering. On this scale, Kara became less about requesting intervention and more about maintaining connection to something larger than their immediate circumstances. The children who lived through the deportation period would carry its psychological impact for the rest of their lives. They learned to be suspicious of authority figures, to hide their emotions, and to expect that security was always temporary. Yet they also developed remarkable resilience, adaptability, and appreciation for human kindness that would serve them well in whatever future awaited them. Their games changed to reflect their reality. Instead of playing house or school, they played hiding and deportation, consciously processing their trauma through the familiar mechanism of childhood play. As the deportation actions continued through the summer and fall of 1942, it became increasingly clear that this was not a temporary relocation, but a systematic elimination of the ghetto's population. The official explanations about work camps became harder to believe as no letters or messages arrived from those who had been taken away. Personal belongings from deportees began appearing in German shops outside the ghetto, suggesting that their owners would not be needing them again. This growing awareness of their true fate would soon crystallize into one of history's most desperate and heroic acts of resistance. But for now, the remaining residents could only endure, adapt, and hope that somehow, against all evidence, they might find a way to survive the inexorable process that seemed determined to erase them from existence entirely. In the depth of winter 1943, when hope seemed as distant as the memory of warmth, transformation began to take place in the hearts and minds of Warsaw's remaining ghetto inhabitants. It was not a sudden awakening, but rather a gradual crystallization of desperation into determination, of helplessness into heroic resolve. Picture the moment when ordinary people, shopkeepers, students, mothers, fathers, made the extraordinary decision that if they were going to die, they would die fighting rather than be led like sheep to slaughter. This was not a decision made lightly or with any illusion of victory. It was a choice made by people who had already lost everything except their dignity and their capacity to resist. The underground resistance movement that emerged in the ghetto was remarkably diverse, bringing together individuals who in normal circumstances might never have worked side by side. Zionist youth groups, communist organizations, Key and Polish nationalist fighters found common cause in their shared determination to strike back at their oppressors. These young people, many barely out of their teens, had watched their families disappear in deportations and had come to understand that cooperation with the authorities meant only a slower path to the same destination. Their transformation from civilians to fighters was both tragic and inspiring. Children forced to become warriors in a war they never chose to fight. The process of organizing, resistance, in such a compressed and heavily monitored environment required extraordinary creativity and courage. Meetings had to be held in secret, with participants arriving separately and at different times to avoid detection. Communication between different resistance groups happened through elaborate networks of trusted intermediaries, with messages often encoded in seemingly innocent conversations about daily life. The constant presence of informants and collaborators meant that even the most trusted neighbor might represent a deadly threat to the resistance. Network. Obtaining weapons in the sealed ghetto presented challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. The German authorities had systematically confiscated all firearms during the initial occupation. Smuggling weapons into the walled area required bribing guards, establishing connections with Polish resistance groups outside the ghetto, and risking immediate execution if caught. The few weapons that did make their way into resistance hands were treated like sacred objects, carefully maintained, hidden in elaborate concealment systems, and passed from person to person, with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Training for armed resistance had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, often in the basements and hidden rooms that had been used as hiding places during deportation actions. Young people who had never held weapons before learned to clean and operate pistols, rifles, and improvised explosive devices by candlelight, with instruction manuals that were often handwritten copies of copies, passed down through underground networks. The irony was not lost on these new fighters that they were learning the arts of war in spaces originally designed as refuges from violence. The psychological preparation for armed resistance was perhaps even more challenging than the practical aspects. These were people who had been raised in families that valued education, culture, and peaceful coexistence. The decision to take up arms represented a fundamental transformation of identity, from victims to active participants in their own fate, from people who hoped for rescue to people who would create their own salvation. This transformation was visible in their faces, their posture, their way of speaking. They carried themselves differently once they had made the commitment to fight. Women played crucial roles in the resistance movement, often serving as couriers, who could move more freely through the ghetto than men, who were more likely to be stopped and searched by patrols. Young women carried messages, weapons, and supplies hidden in clothing, food packages, and even in hollowed-out books. Their ability to appear innocent while conducting dangerous activities was essential to the resistance network's survival. Many of these women had lost husbands, fathers, and brothers in the deportations, and their participation in the resistance was both an act of revenge and a way of honoring the memory of their dead. The resistance groups spent months developing detailed plans for their inevitable confrontation with German forces. They studied the layout of the ghetto with the intensity of military strategists, identifying the best locations for ambushes, escape routes, and defensive positions. Buildings were modified in secret, with hidden passages created between apartments, and reinforced positions prepared in strategic locations. The fighters knew that they would be vastly outnumbered and outgunned, so their strategy focused on making every street, every building, every room as costly as possible for the German forces to capture. Intelligence gathering became a crucial activity for the resistance, with members carefully observing German patrol patterns, noting the locations of guard posts, and trying to determine the size and composition of the forces that would likely be used against them. This information was collected piece by piece, often through seemingly casual observation by people going about their daily routines. The resistance fighters learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a major German operation might be planned: increased patrols, changes in guard schedules, or the arrival of additional military personnel. The emotional toll of preparing for what everyone understood would likely be a final battle was enormous. Fighters wrote letters to family members who might survive them, creating testaments that expressed their love, their hopes for the future, and their reasons for choosing to fight rather than submit. These letters were often hidden with trusted friends, or buried in secret locations, representing a desperate attempt to ensure that their motivations and sacrifices would be remembered by future generations. As winter gave way to spring in 1943, the remaining ghetto population could sense that something significant was approaching. The deportation actions had slowed, but everyone understood that this was likely a temporary respite before a final, complete liquidation of the ghetto. The resistance fighters used this time to conduct final preparations, to say their goodbyes, and to make peace with the choices they had made. They knew that their chances of survival were minimal, while they had chosen to transform their deaths from meaningless tragedies into acts of defiance that would echo through history. The decision to fight also involved complex moral calculations about the broader ghetto population. The resistance leaders understood that their actions would likely provoke terrible reprisals against civilians who had no connection to the resistance movement. The German authorities had a well-established pattern of collective punishment, where the actions of a few resulted in suffering for many. Yet, the resistance fighters concluded that the alternative, passive submission to systematic murder, was morally unacceptable, regardless of the consequences. Training sessions in the final weeks before the uprising took on an almost ritual quality, with experienced fighters passing on their knowledge to newer recruits with the solemnity of teachers preparing students for the most important examination of their lives. The limited ammunition available meant that every shot would have to count, so marksmanship practice was conducted with empty weapons, with fighters learning to aim and fire without wasting precious bullets. The psychological preparation was equally important, as fighters needed to be ready to kill and to die with equal composure. The transformation of ordinary civilians into resistance fighters was visible in small details that spoke to larger changes in their understanding of themselves and their situation. Young people who had once dreamed of university studies or professional careers now spoke fluently about tactics, weapons, and military strategy. Mothers who had spent years protecting their children from violence now taught them how to create and throw improvised explosives. Elderly people who had lived through previous wars shared their knowledge of survival under extreme conditions, becoming advisors to a new generation of fighters. The final days before the uprising were marked by an intensity of human connection that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. People who knew they might not survive another week expressed years of accumulated love, gratitude, and hope in conversations that carried the weight of final farewells. Resistance fighters made rounds through the ghetto, visiting friends and family members to say goodbye without explicitly acknowledging that these might be their final meetings. The knowledge that time was running out gave every interaction a poignancy that made ordinary conversations feel like profound declarations of human solidarity. As April 1943 approached, the resistance fighters completed their preparations with the methodical care of people who understood that every detail might mean the difference between a meaningful death and a meaningless one. They had transformed themselves from victims into warriors, from people who waited for rescue into people who would write their own final chapter. Their decision to fight represented one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. The moment when people facing certain death chose to make their last act an affirmation of human dignity rather than a surrender to despair. The morning of April 19, 1943, dawned clear and cold in Warsaw, with the pale spring sunlight filtering through the smoke that would soon become a permanent feature of the ghetto's skyline. Imagine the silence of those early hours before dawn, when the resistance fighters took their final positions in buildings that had been transformed into fortresses, in sewers that had become supply routes, and on rooftops that would serve as observation posts and sniper nests. This was the quiet before a storm that would rage for 27 days and nights, transforming a 3-square-mile area of occupied Warsaw into one of the most significant battlefields of the Second World War. The German plan for what they called The final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto was designed to be swift and efficient. Modeled on the successful deportation actions of the previous year, SS Brigadier Jürgenstroop had assembled a force of over 2,000 men, including SS troops, Wehrmacht soldiers, Polish police, and Lithuanian and Latvian auxiliaries. They entered the ghetto that morning expecting to encounter the same passive resistance they had met before, people hiding in basements and attics, hoping to avoid detection, but ultimately submitting to deportation when discovered. Instead, they walked into carefully prepared ambushes that would transform their routine operation into an urban warfare nightmare. The first shots of the uprising were fired at the corner of Nalewki and Gizia streets, where a German column advancing toward the central ghetto area suddenly found itself under attack from multiple directions. The resistance fighters had positioned themselves in windows, doorways, and rooftops, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the street into a killing zone. The German soldiers, accustomed to dealing with unarmed civilians, were caught completely off guard by the coordinated nature of the attack. Several vehicles were destroyed with improvised explosives, and the advancing column was forced to retreat, leaving behind weapons, equipment that the resistance fighters quickly gathered for their own use. The sound of gunfire echoing through the narrow streets of the ghetto created a psychological transformation that was as important as its tactical effect. For years, the residents had heard only the crack of German rifles and the rumble of deportation trucks. Now, for the first time, they heard the sound of their own weapons firing back. This shift from victim to combatant was audible in every shot, visible in the faces of people who had learned to keep their eyes downcast but now stood proudly behind barricades and improvised fortifications. The fighting that followed was unlike anything seen before in occupied Europe. This was not a battle between armies on open ground, but urban warfare conducted in an environment where every building was potentially a fortress. Every basement, a bunker, and every rooftop, a strategic position. The resistance fighters had prepared for months, creating hidden passages between buildings, stockpiling weapons and ammunition in secret caches, and establishing communication networks that allowed different groups to coordinate their attacks, even when cut off from direct contact. The German response escalated rapidly as it became clear that this was not a simple police action, but a genuine military challenge. Artillery was brought into action, with cannons positioned outside the ghetto walls to shell buildings where resistance fighters were believed to be hiding. The sound of these bombardments was thunderous, echoing off the brick walls and cobblestone streets, shaking buildings that were already weakened by years of overcrowding and neglect. Yet even under this intense fire, the resistance fighters continued to emerge from their hiding places to engage German patrols and rescue civilians trapped in damaged buildings. Fire became both a weapon and an enemy for both sides in the conflict. The German forces began systematically burning buildings to force out the defenders, using flamethrowers and incendiary devices to create infernos that consumed entire city blocks. The resistance fighters, in turn, used fire as a tactical tool, setting buildings ablaze to deny the Germans strategic positions or to cover their own movements between defensive positions. The smoke from these fires created a perpetual twilight in the ghetto, with visibility reduced to mere yards and the air thick with ash and the acrid smell of burning wood, fabric, and worse. The civilian population, caught in this urban battleground, faced impossible choices with each passing hour. Some joined the resistance fighters, taking up whatever weapons they could find: kitchen knives, improvised clubs, stones to throw from rooftops. Others sought shelter in the elaborate bunker systems that had been constructed during the deportation period, underground networks that now served as refuges from the battle raging above. These bunkers, originally designed to hide families from deportation teams, became cramped sanctuaries where dozens of people lived in darkness sharing whatever food and water they had while listening to the sounds of combat overhead. The resistance fighters themselves adapted quickly to the realities of urban warfare, developing tactics that maximized their limited resources and took advantage of their intimate knowledge of the ghetto's geography. They learned to move through buildings, using passages cut through walls, avoiding the deadly open streets where German snipers waited. Communication between different fighting groups was maintained through an elaborate system of runners, often children or teenagers who could move quickly through the maze of damaged buildings and hidden tunnels. As the days passed, the nature of the fighting evolved from set-piece battles to a constant game of cat and mouse. German patrols would advance cautiously through streets they thought they had cleared, only to come under fire from fighters who would emerge from hidden positions. Buildings that appeared to be abandoned would suddenly come alive with gunfire, forcing the German forces to fight for every room, every staircase, every basement. The psychological effect on the German soldiers was profound. Men who had been trained to see ghetto residents as subhuman were now facing them as skilled and determined opponents who refused to surrender even when their situation appeared hopeless. The leadership of the resistance was remarkably young, with many commanders still in their early 20s. Mordecai Anilovich, the overall commander of the uprising, was just 24 years old when he coordinated the defense of an entire urban area against overwhelming odds. These young leaders had to make life and death decisions constantly: when to attack, when to retreat, how to distribute their limited ammunition, which positions to defend and which to abandon. Their youth, rather than being a disadvantage, seemed to give them a flexibility and daring that older, more conventional military leaders might have lacked. The international dimension of the uprising was limited but significant. The resistance fighters had established communication links with Polish resistance groups outside the ghetto, who provided limited supplies and moral support. However, the help that could be provided was minimal. The Polish resistance was itself under severe pressure from German security forces, and their resources were stretched thin across the entire occupied country. The resistance fighters were essentially on their own, fighting with weapons they had smuggled or captured, using ammunition they had hoarded over months of careful preparation. Medical care for wounded fighters and civilians became one of the most challenging aspects of the uprising. The ghetto's hospital had been destroyed in the early days of fighting, and medical supplies were almost non-existent. Doctors and nurses worked in basement facilities by candlelight, performing surgery without anesthesia and treating wounds with whatever materials they could improvise. The dedication of these medical personnel, who continued their work despite the constant danger and impossible conditions, represented another form of resistance, a refusal to let suffering go untreated even in the midst of a war zone. The psychological toll on both fighters and civilians was enormous, yet it seemed to strengthen rather than weaken their resolve. People who had lived in terror for years now found a strange peace in action, in the ability to fight back against forces that had seemed omnipotent. Children who had learned to be silent and invisible now served as messengers and lookouts, their small size and knowledge of hiding places making them invaluable members of the resistance network. The elderly, who had often been the first victims of deportation actions, now shared their knowledge of previous wars and conflicts, becoming advisors and strategists for the younger fighters. Communication with the outside world was sporadic but crucial for maintaining morale. The resistance fighters managed to send messages to London and other Allied capitals, informing the world of their struggle and pleading for assistance that they knew would probably never come. These messages served less as practical requests for help than as testimonies, ways of ensuring that their story would be known even if none of them survived to tell it themselves. The knowledge that the world was watching gave additional meaning to their sacrifice, transforming a local act of resistance into a symbol of human dignity that would inspire others facing similar circumstances. As the uprising entered its second and third weeks, the intensity of the fighting began to take its toll on both sides. The German forces, despite their overwhelming superiority in numbers and equipment, were suffering casualties that shocked their commanders. SS reports back to Berlin complained about the unexpected resistance and the difficulty of rooting out fighters who seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts in the smoke-filled streets. The resistance fighters, meanwhile, were running low on ammunition and medical supplies, and their numbers were being reduced daily by casualties and the constant strain of combat. The transformation of the ghetto into a battlefield had created a strange new world where normal rules no longer applied. Time was measured not in hours and days, but in intervals between attacks, periods of relative quiet when fighters could rest and tend to their wounds. Food and water became more precious than ammunition, as supply lines were constantly under threat, and foraging expeditions required running gauntlets of sniper fire and artillery bombardment. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, with most fighters catching brief moments of rest while maintaining watch for the next German assault. The sound of the uprising, the constant crack of rifle fire, the boom of artillery, the roar of flames consuming buildings created an auditory landscape that spoke to the desperation and determination of people who had chosen to make their last stand a meaningful one. This was not the silence of victimhood, but the noise of resistance, the sound of people who had decided that if they were going to die, they would die fighting. And in that choice, they transformed themselves from victims of history into its authors, writing a chapter that would echo through the decades and inspire resistance movements around the world. By the beginning of May 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto had been transformed into something that resembled the surface of another planet, more than a human habitation. Entire city blocks lay in ruins, their brick and mortars scattered across streets that were now obstacle courses of rubble and twisted metal. The smoke that had darkened the sky for weeks now hung like a permanent shroud over the devastation, creating an otherworldly atmosphere where visibility rarely extended more than a few dozen yards in this apocalyptic landscape. The final act of one of history's most remarkable displays of human courage was being written by people who understood that their story would end in death, but were determined to control how that ending would be. Told the resistance fighters who remained alive after 3 weeks of continuous combat were no longer the same people who had fired the first shots of the uprising. They moved like shadows through the ruins, their faces blackened with smoke and grime, their clothing torn and blood-stained, tear eyes holding a mixture of exhaustion and unwavering determination. Many were wounded, carrying injuries that, in normal circumstances, would have required immediate medical attention, but which they now treated as simply another condition of their existence. They had learned to function on minimal sleep, scarce food, and the constant adrenaline that comes from knowing that every moment might be your last. The German forces, meanwhile, had been forced to completely revise their tactics and strategy. What was supposed to have been a simple deportation action had evolved into the longest urban battle that German forces had fought during the entire war. Says Brigadier Stroop's daily reports to his superiors in Berlin grew increasingly frustrated as he tried to explain why a few hundred poorly armed civilians were requiring such enormous resources to defeat. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. Many had been told that they were fighting subhuman opponents, yet they found themselves facing fighters who displayed tactical skill, courage, and determination that commanded unwilling respect. The strategy of systematic burning that the German forces had adopted was slowly but inexorably reducing the ghetto to ash and rubble, building by building, block by block. The fires consumed everything that had once been homes, shops, schools, and places of worship. The resistance fighters adapted to this destruction by moving their operations underground, using the extensive sewer system in the bunkers that had been prepared during the deportation period. These subterranean hideouts became their final refuges, cramped spaces where dozens of people lived in darkness, sharing whatever food and water remained while planning their last acts of defiance. The leadership structure of the resistance, which had begun the uprising with careful organization and clear chains of command, gradually dissolved as communications were severed and leaders were killed or separated from their units. What remained was a collection of small groups, each operating independently but united by their shared commitment to continue fighting until the end. These groups developed their own tactics and made their own decisions about when and how to engage the enemy, creating a decentralized resistance that was nearly impossible for the German forces to completely eliminate. Ammunition, which had been scarce from the beginning of the uprising, was now almost completely exhausted. Resistance fighters learned to make every shot count, carefully selecting targets and conserving their few remaining bullets for moments when they could achieve maximum impact. Some groups resorted to hand-to-hand combat, using knives, clubs, and improvised weapons to continue their fight. Others focused on psychological warfare, using their knowledge of the underground tunnel system to appear suddenly in areas the Germans thought they had secured, firing a few shots and then disappearing before a response could be organized. The civilian population that remained in the ghetto faced choices that were both heartbreaking and heroic. Some chose to join the fighters in their final battles, picking up weapons from fallen comrades and taking positions alongside experienced resistance members. Others focused on survival, hiding in bunkers and hoping to outlast the destruction above ground. Still, others made the conscious decision to die on their own terms rather than face capture, deportation, or execution at German hands. These individual choices, multiplied across hundreds of people, created a collective narrative of a community that refused to submit even when resistance seemed futile. The stories of individual heroism during these final days became legends that would be passed down through generations. There was the story of a young woman who continued to serve as a courier between resistance groups, even after being severely wounded, crawling through sewers and damaged buildings to maintain communication links. There was the elderly man who used his intimate knowledge of the ghetto's pre-war architecture to guide fighters through hidden passages that connected buildings the Germans thought were isolated. There was a group of children who served as lookouts and messengers, their small size and fearlessness making them invaluable members of the resistance network. The psychological atmosphere during these final days was marked by a strange mixture of despair and transcendence. People who had lost everything material, their homes, their possessions, their loved ones, found themselves experiencing moments of profound spiritual clarity. The proximity of death seemed to strip away all the minor concerns and social conventions that had once seemed important, leaving only the essential human experiences of love, courage, loyalty, and hope. Conversations between fighters and civilians took on a quality of intense honesty and emotional depth that might never have emerged under normal circumstances. Religious observance during this period took on new meanings and forms as people grappled with questions of faith and divine justice that had no easy answers. Some found comfort in traditional prayers and rituals, adapting them to their underground circumstances and using them as sources of strength and community. Others developed new spiritual frameworks that could accommodate the reality of their situation while still maintaining connection to something larger than their immediate suffering. The approaching Jewish holiday of Passover, with its themes of liberation from bondage, carried particular poignancy for people who were writing their own story of resistance to oppression. The German response to the continued resistance became increasingly indiscriminate and destructive. Artillery bombardments intensified, with shells falling randomly throughout the ghetto area regardless of whether specific resistance activity had been detected. Flamethrowers were used to burn out bunkers and underground hideouts, creating scenes of horror as people were forced to choose between death by fire and death by capture. The systematic nature of this destruction was designed not just to eliminate the remaining fighters, but to ensure that nothing would remain of the ghetto that could serve as a symbol or inspiration for future resistance. Communication with the outside world became sporadic and eventually ceased entirely as the resistance's radio equipment was destroyed and their messengers were killed or captured. The fighters' connection to the broader war effort and to potential sources of support was severed, leaving them isolated in their burning ghetto with only their own resources and determination to sustain them. This isolation, rather than weakening their resolve, seemed to purify their motivation. They were fighting now, not for rescue or victory, but simply to affirm their humanity and dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The bunker at 18 Muir Street, which served as the headquarters for the resistance leadership, became the site of one of the uprising's most tragic and heroic final chapters. As German forces closed in on this last major stronghold, the remaining leaders faced a choice between capture and suicide. Mordecai Anilovich, the young commander who had coordinated the entire uprising, gathered his closest comrades for a final meeting where they discussed their options and made their final decisions. The knowledge that they would not survive to see the liberation they had fought for did not diminish their satisfaction in having chosen to resist rather than submit. The discovery of mass graves and the systematic burning of bodies by German forces provided grim evidence of the uprising's human cost, but also testimony to the courage of people who had chosen to die fighting rather than be murdered passively. Each body represented not just a casualty, but a conscious choice to resist, an individual decision to make their death meaningful rather than meaningless. The German forces' obvious efforts to hide evidence of the resistance suggested that even the perpetrators understood the symbolic power of what had occurred in the ghetto. The final shots of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising were fired on May 16, 1943. Nearly a month after the first German troops had entered the ghetto, expecting to complete a routine deportation action, the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, which had stood for generations as a center of Jewish life and culture, was dynamited by German forces as a symbolic conclusion to their operation. The explosion that reduced this magnificent building to rubble was intended to represent the final elimination of Jewish presence in Warsaw. Yet, it served instead as a dramatic punctuation mark to one of history's most remarkable stories of resistance and human dignity. In the immediate aftermath of the uprising's end, the physical destruction was total. The ghetto area was reduced to acres of rubble and ash, with scarcely a building left standing. Yet, the moral and spiritual victory achieved by the resistance fighters was equally complete. They had transformed the narrative of their community's destruction from a story of passive victimization into an epic of heroic resistance. They had proven that even under the most impossible circumstances, people could choose dignity over submission, courage over compliance, and meaningful death over meaningless survival. Their choice to fight and their manner of fighting became a beacon of hope for resistance movements worldwide and a testament to the indestructible nature of the human spirit when it commits itself to the defense of fundamental human values. While the sounds of gunfire and explosions drew the world's attention to the dramatic resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, another form of resistance had been quietly unfolding for years in the shadows of that same destroyed community. Was a war fought not with weapons, but with words, not with bullets, but with documentation, not for immediate military victory, but for the preservation of truth for future generations. Picture a mild-mannered historian named Emanuel Ringelblum, a man whose greatest weapon was his pen and whose battlefield was the cramped apartments and hidden rooms, where he gathered testimonies, documents, and evidence of what was happening to his people. His resistance took the form of the most comprehensive documentation project ever undertaken under conditions of genocidal persecution. It's an archive that would ensure that even if none of them survived, their story would endure. Emanuel Ringelblum had been a respected historian and teacher before the war. The kind of scholarly man who spent his days in libraries and archives, pursuing academic research with the quiet passion of someone who believed that understanding the past was essential for navigating the present. When the Germans invaded Poland and began implementing their anti-Jewish policies, Ringelblum found himself trapped in Warsaw along with hundreds of thousands of other civilians. Yet, rather than simply focusing on his own survival, he made a decision that was both remarkably prescient and incredibly dangerous. He would document everything that was happening to his community, creating a historical record that would survive, even if the people creating it did not. The project that became known as One Shabbat, Hebrew for Joy of Sabbath, a code name that disguised the archive's true purpose, began in October 1940 as a small group of intellectuals, writers, and ordinary citizens who met regularly to discuss their experiences and observations. What started as informal conversations gradually evolved into a systematic documentation effort that would eventually involve hundreds of contributors and produce thousands of pages of testimonies, reports, essays, and original research. The irony of the name was not lost on its participants. There was little joy to be found in their circumstances, but they were determined to honor the Sabbath principle of bearing witness to truth. The headquarters of this clandestine archive was located in the building at 68 Nalalipki Street, where Ringelblum had established what appeared to be a small soup kitchen and social service center. The kitchen served real meals to hungry ghetto residents, but it also provided perfect cover for the constant stream of visitors who came to share their stories, deliver documents, or participate in the archive's research activities. In the basement of this building, surrounded by the ordinary activities of food preparation and distribution, one of history's most important acts of documentation was taking place. The scope of the One Shabbat project was breathtakingly comprehensive. Ringelblum and his collaborators were not content simply to record the major events of their persecution. They wanted to capture everything: the texture of daily life under occupation, the psychological impact of gradual dehumanization, the ways that people adapted to impossible circumstances, the small acts of kindness and cruelty that revealed human nature under extreme stress. They collected official German documents and proclamations, but they also gathered candy wrappers, theater programs, and children's drawings. They interviewed community leaders and prominent intellectuals, but they also sought out the voices of street vendors, smugglers, and beggars who had different perspectives on their shared experience. The methodology that Ringelblum developed for this unprecedented project reflected both his scholarly training, and his understanding of the unique historical moment they were living through. He recognized that traditional historical sources, official documents, newspaper accounts, governmental records would either be destroyed or would present only the perpetrator's version of events. To create an accurate historical record, he needed to collect testimony from the victims themselves, preserving their own words and perspectives before they were silenced forever. This meant developing new techniques for conducting interviews under dangerous conditions, creating secure systems for storing sensitive documents, and establishing networks of contributors who could gather information from across the ghetto community. The contributors to the One Shabbat archive represented a remarkable cross-section of ghetto society. They were rabbis and secular intellectuals, wealthy businessmen and destitute refugees, teenagers and elderly survivors of previous persecutions. What united them was not their social status or educational background, but their shared commitment to bearing witness, to ensuring that their experiences would not be forgotten or misrepresented by history. Some contributors wrote detailed essays analyzing the political and social implications of their situation. Others provided simple testimonies about their daily experiences. Still others contributed documents they had managed to save or copy from official sources. The physical challenges of maintaining such an archive under ghetto conditions were enormous. Paper was scarce and expensive. Writing materials were difficult to obtain, and secure storage space was almost non-existent. The archive operated on minimal resources, with contributors often writing on whatever materials they could find. Scraps of paper, margins of books, even pieces of cardboard, typewriters were precious commodities that had to be hidden and used sparingly to avoid attracting attention. The constant threat of searches by German authorities or their collaborators meant that documents had to be concealed in creative ways, often disguised as ordinary household items or hidden in specially constructed hiding places. The psychological challenges were perhaps even greater than the physical ones. Contributors to the archive were documenting their own destruction, recording the gradual elimination of their community while living through that elimination themselves. They interviewed family members and friends, knowing that these might be the last conversations they would ever have with these people. They wrote about their own suffering and loss while simultaneously trying to maintain the emotional distance necessary for objective historical analysis. The weight of knowing that they were creating what might be the only surviving record of their community's existence added enormous pressure to their already impossible circumstances. The security measures that the archive team developed were elaborate and constantly evolving as the dangers around them intensified. Contributors used code names and aliases to protect their identities. Documents were copied in multiple versions and stored in different locations to ensure that the destruction of one cache would not eliminate the entire record. Meeting times and locations were changed frequently, and participants were trained in techniques for avoiding surveillance and detection. The very existence of the archive was known only to a small number of trusted individuals, and even they were not always aware of the full scope of the project. Ringelblum himself served not just as the archive's organizer, but as its philosophical guide, helping contributors understand the historical significance of what they were doing and encouraging them to continue their work even when the dangers seemed overwhelming. His own writings revealed a man who understood that he was racing against time, trying to complete an essential historical task before the forces of destruction eliminated both the archive and its creators. He wrote with urgency about the need to preserve not just the facts of their persecution, but the human reality of their experience, the emotions, the thoughts, the daily struggles that would be lost forever if not recorded immediately. The content that the archive collected provides an unparalleled window into the experience of life and death in the Warsaw ghetto. There are detailed reports on the black market economy that sustained life when official rations were insufficient for survival. There are psychological studies of how children adapted to conditions of extreme stress and deprivation. There are sociological analyses of how traditional social structures and hierarchies were transformed under the pressure of shared suffering. There are theological discussions about how religious faith could be maintained in circumstances that seem to challenge every traditional understanding of divine justice and protection. Perhaps most remarkably, the archive includes materials that document not just suffering, but also the remarkable resilience and creativity that people displayed, even under the most impossible circumstances. There are records of underground schools that continue to operate despite the prohibition on Jewish education. There are programs from theatrical performances and concerts that were organized to provide moments of beauty and normalcy in lives that had been stripped of both. There are collections of jokes, songs, stories that people created to maintain their sanity and sense of humor in the face of systematic dehumanization. The decision to bury the archive in metal containers and CIE milk cans was made as the deportation actions intensified and it became clear that the ghetto's days were numbered. Ringelblum and his collaborators understood that they were unlikely to survive to see their work published, but they were determined to ensure that their documentation would outlive them. The burial sites were chosen carefully, marked with subtle signs that future searchers might recognize, and documented in ways that would help recovery efforts after the war. This act of burying their life's work represented both an acknowledgement of their likely fate and an expression of faith that truth would ultimately triumph over the forces trying to destroy it. The transformation of these ordinary people into secret historians and documentarians represents one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in human history. Under conditions that stripped them of almost every resource and threatened them with death for the slightest resistance, they managed to create a comprehensive historical record that rivals anything produced under ideal academic conditions. Their work was motivated not by career advancement or scholarly recognition, but by a simple yet profound conviction that their story deserved to be told and that future generations needed to understand what had happened to them, key in choosing to document their destruction rather than simply endure it. They transformed themselves from victims into witnesses, from passive subjects of history into active authors of their own memorial. Within the metal containers and milk cans that would eventually be buried beneath the rubble of Warsaw, an extraordinary collection of human voices spoke across time to future generations, who might never otherwise understand what it truly meant to live through systematic persecution. These were not the sanitized accounts of official historians writing decades after events, but raw, immediate testimonies from people who were documenting their own destruction as it happened around them. Imagine reading a diary entry written by a mother describing how she divided a single piece of bread among her 3 children, knowing it might be their last meal together. Picture finding a child's drawing of their family with empty spaces, where relatives had already been deported to unknown destinations. These documents possessed a immediacy and authenticity that no subsequent historical reconstruction could ever match. The testimonies collected by the One Shabbat archive revealed the incredible diversity of experience within what outsiders might have seen as a homogeneous community of victims. Each voice in the collection told a different story of adaptation, resistance, or surrender to circumstances beyond their control. There was the account of a wealthy businessman who had lost his fortune but discovered unexpected reserves of spiritual strength. There was the testimony of a young woman who had become a smuggler, risking her life daily to bring food to her family. There was the narrative of an elderly rabbi who struggled to maintain his faith while watching his congregation disappear one deportation at a time. Each story was unique, yet together they created a composite portrait of human beings grappling with the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The children's contributions to the archive were particularly poignant, revealing how young minds processed experiences that would have challenged adult comprehension. School essays written by 12-year-olds described their daily routines with matter-of-fact acceptance of conditions that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They wrote about standing in bread lines for hours, about sleeping in overcrowded rooms with strangers, about saying goodbye to friends who were selected for deportation. Their writing displayed a premature sophistication about subjects like death, separation, and survival. Yet, it also contained flashes of the resilience and hope that seemed to be indestructible parts of human nature. The economic documentation within the archive provided unprecedented insight into how an entire community adapted to artificial scarcity and systematic economic destruction. Detailed records showed how black market prices fluctuated based on rumored deportations or changes in German policy. There were careful analyses of the caloric content of official rations compared to minimum survival requirements, documenting the mathematical precision with which starvation was being implemented. Business records revealed how traditional commercial relationships were transformed when normal currency became worthless and barter systems emerged based on bread, medicine, and information. Religious and cultural materials in the archive demonstrated the extraordinary efforts people made to maintain their spiritual and intellectual lives, even when their physical survival was threatened daily. There were transcripts of secret religious services held in hidden rooms with prayers adapted to acknowledge their unprecedented circumstances. There were records of underground schools where children learned Hebrew, mathematics, and literature by candlelight in basement classrooms. There were collections of songs and poems created specifically to address their situation. Artistic works that provided both emotional outlet and cultural continuity in the face of systematic cultural destruction. The medical documentation preserved by the archive revealed both the devastating health impact of ghetto conditions and the heroic efforts of healthcare providers to continue their work without adequate resources. Detailed case studies describe the progression of diseases that flourished in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. There were records of surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, of psychiatric treatments provided without medication, of public health measures attempted without governmental support. These documents showed how medical professionals maintained their commitment to healing even when the broader society around them was organized around the principle of systematic killing. Perhaps most remarkably, the archive contained extensive documentation of the resistance activities that would later culminate in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. These materials included recruitment records for underground organizations, training manuals for urban warfare, and strategic analysis of German military capabilities and weaknesses. There were personal accounts from resistance fighters describing their psychological preparation for what they knew would likely be suicide missions. These documents revealed that the armed resistance that shocked the world in April 1943 had been planned and prepared for months by people who understood exactly what they were choosing to do. The process of gathering these materials required the development of interview techniques and documentation methods that had never been attempted under such dangerous conditions. Contributors learned to conduct detailed interviews while maintaining constant vigilance for signs of approaching danger. They developed shorthand systems that allowed them to record testimony quickly and quietly. They created coding systems that would protect the identity of contributors if documents were discovered by German authorities. Every aspect of the documentation process had to be adapted to function in an environment where discovery meant death. The psychological profiles contained within the archive provided insight into how different personality types and backgrounds influenced individual responses to extreme persecution. There were detailed studies of how some people became more religious under stress, while others abandoned their faith entirely. There were analyses of how family relationships changed when traditional gender roles and generational hierarchies were disrupted by the struggle for survival. There were observations about how humor, creativity, and intellectual curiosity persisted, even in circumstances that seemed designed to crush all higher human functions. Women's voices were particularly well represented in the archive, reflecting their crucial roles in maintaining family and community life under impossible conditions. Their testimonies described the specific challenges they faced as mothers trying to protect children in an environment where protection was impossible, as wives trying to maintain marriages when normal domestic life had been destroyed, as daughters caring for elderly parents who could no longer care for themselves. These accounts revealed how traditional women's work, cooking, cleaning, childcare, family management, became acts of resistance when performed under conditions designed to make such care impossible. The intellectual analysis contained within the archive demonstrated that even under extreme duress, human beings maintained their capacity for abstract thinking and philosophical reflection. There were essays examining the political implications of their persecution, comparing their situation to other historical examples of systematic oppression. There were theological discussions about how their experiences challenged traditional religious frameworks and required new approaches to understanding divine justice. There were sociological studies analyzing how extreme circumstances revealed previously hidden aspects of human nature and social organization. The documentation of daily life routines revealed how people created structure and meaning in circumstances that seemed to offer neither. Detailed schedules showed how families organized their days around the search for food, the avoidance of danger, and the maintenance of some semblance of normal family life. There were records of birthday celebrations held with imaginary cakes, of wedding ceremonies conducted without official recognition, of funeral rites performed for people whose bodies had been taken away for mass burial. These accounts showed how human beings insisted on marking the important moments of life, even when the broader context suggested that individual lives had no value. The final entries in many of the archive's documents were written as deportation. Actions intensified, and contributors understood that their time was running out. These farewell messages combined practical information about hidden valuables and important documents with personal reflections on the meaning of their experiences in hopes for what future generations might learn from their testimonies. The knowledge that they were writing their own epitaphs gave these final entries a particular poignancy and power. As people tried to distill the essential truths of their lives into words that might survive when they could not, the decision about which materials to preserve and which to abandon as burial time approached represented one of the most difficult editorial challenges in human history. With limited space in the containers that would be buried, choices had to be made about which voices would speak to the future and which would be silenced forever. These decisions were made democratically when possible, with contributors voting on which materials were most essential for future understanding. The criteria they used reflected their understanding of what future generations would need to know, not just what had happened to them, but how it had felt to live through it, and what it revealed about human nature under extreme stress. The summer of 1942 brought with it a terrible urgency to the work of the One Shabbat archive, as deportation trains carried away thousands of ghetto residents each day. Emanuel Ringelblum and his collaborators understood that their documentation project was approaching its conclusion, not through completion, but through the approaching extinction of both the archive subjects and its creators. The decision to bury their life's work represented one of the most profound acts of faith in human history, faith that truth would eventually triumph over lies, that memory would overcome forgetting, and that future generations would care enough to search for the voices of the dead. Picture the careful preparations that preceded this burial, conducted in the basement of the building at 68 now Lipke Street. The sounds of deportation actions echoed through the ghetto above, working by candlelight to avoid attracting attention. Small groups of contributors gathered to make final decisions about which documents would be preserved for posterity. The atmosphere was solemn, yet purposeful, like a funeral service for the living. Everyone understood that they were not just burying papers, but entombing their own voices, creating what might be the only surviving testimony to their existence and their community's destruction. The physical process of preparing the archive for burial required ingenious solutions to unprecedented challenges. Metal containers had to be procured secretly and without arousing suspicion. No easy task in a community where every piece of metal was valuable and closely monitored. Milk cans were chosen for some portions of the archive because they were common household items that would not attract attention if seen or heard being moved. Each container had to be waterproofed carefully to protect its precious contents from moisture and decay. Documents were wrapped in oilcloth, arranged in careful order, and accompanied by detailed inventories that would help future searchers understand what they had found. The selection process for determining which materials would be included in the burial represented a heart-wrenching exercise in historical triage. Every document, every testimony, every photograph represented someone's attempt to be remembered. Yet, space limitations meant that many voices would have to be left behind. So priority was given to materials that provided the most comprehensive Picture of ghetto life representative samples rather than complete collections. Personal letters and family photographs, precious as they were to their owners, were often excluded in favor of documents that told broader stories about the community's experience. Ringelblum himself struggled with the emotional weight. These decisions, knowing that each excluded document represented not just lost information, but the silencing of individual voices that would never speak again. His own writings from this period reveal a man torn between his historian's instinct to preserve everything and the practical reality that selectivity was necessary for the archive's survival. He wrote passionate appeals to his collaborators to understand that their sacrifice, giving up their personal memories to preserve the community's story, was itself a form of resistance against forces that wanted to erase all trace of their existence. The burial sites were chosen with careful attention to both concealment and eventual discovery. The archive team needed locations that would be hidden from German searches, but accessible to future investigators who might come looking for buried materials after the war. They selected spots beneath buildings that appeared structurally sound, enough to survive bombardment, in areas where subtle markers could be left to guide future searchers. The exact locations were recorded in coded messages that were entrusted to individuals who might have better chances of survival than the main group of contributors. The first burial took place in August 1942 as the massive deportation action, known as the Great Deportation, was destroying the ghetto community day by day. 10 metal containers and milk cans were carefully lowered into a hiding place beneath the cellar floor at 68 Nowalipki Street. The ceremony was brief but profound, with participants understanding that they were conducting both a burial and a resurrection, putting their voices to death in the present so that they might speak again in an unknown future. Some contributors said prayers over the buried materials. Others simply stood in silent contemplation of what they had accomplished and what they were losing. The psychological impact of burying their life's work was devastating for many contributors. These documents represented months or years of careful observation, thoughtful analysis, and passionate commitment to truth-telling. Watching them disappear into the earth felt like witnessing their own premature burial. Yet there was also a sense of completion and even triumph in knowing that they had succeeded in creating something that might outlast the forces trying to destroy them. The act of burial transformed them from victims racing against time into people who had already achieved a form of victory over their persecutors. The second burial occurred in February 1943, as the resistance movement was preparing for its final confrontation with the German forces. By this time, most of the original One Chabak contributors had been deported or killed, leaving only a small group to complete the work. This second cache contained many of the archive's most important materials, including detailed analyses of German policy, extensive testimonies from deportation survivors, and Ringelblum's own comprehensive study of ghetto life. The burial was conducted under even more dangerous conditions than the first, with participants knowing that discovery would mean immediate execution. The third and final burial took place in April 1943, just as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was beginning, with German forces already entering the ghetto for what they announced would be its final liquidation. The remaining archive materials were hastily gathered and buried in a desperate race against time. This final cache contained many personal documents and family materials that contributors had initially hoped to keep with them, but now realized must be preserved for history. The burial was conducted under the sound of gunfire and explosions, with participants understanding that they were likely performing their final act of resistance. Emanuel Ringelblum's own fate became intertwined with that of his archive in a way that demonstrated his absolute commitment to the documentation project. Rather than fleeing the ghetto when he had opportunities to escape, he chose to remain with his archive until the end, continuing to collect testimonies and refine his analyses. even as the deportation actions decimated his contributor network. His final writings, included in The Last Burial, contained detailed instructions for future researchers about how to interpret and understand the materials they would find. The markers left a guide. Future searchers were subtle but carefully planned. Contributors used architectural details, arrangements of stones, tilts, and other inconspicuous signs that might survive the destruction they knew was coming. These markers were documented in codes that were shared with trusted individuals who might escape the ghetto and survive to guide post-war search efforts. The system was designed to be comprehensible to serious researchers while remaining invisible to casual observers or hostile forces. The faith required to bury these materials, to believe that someone would someday come looking for them and would understand their significance, was extraordinary given the circumstances in which the burials took place. The contributors were watching their entire world being systematically destroyed. Yet they maintained belief that truth and memory would ultimately prove stronger than the forces of destruction arrayed against them. This faith was both religious and secular, grounded in deep convictions about human nature and historical justice that transcended their immediate circumstances. The discovery of the first cache, September 1946, validated the archive creators' faith in ways they could never have imagined. When construction workers found 10 metal containers and milk cans beneath the ruins of 68 now Lipke Street, they uncovered what historians would later recognize as one of the most important historical documents ever created. The materials had survived both the destruction of the ghetto and the devastation of post-war Warsaw, emerging from their underground hiding place to fulfill their creators' dreams of speaking to future generations. The second cache was discovered in December 1950, confirming that Ringelblum and his collaborators had succeeded in creating multiple copies of their most important materials. This discovery included many documents that had been thought lost forever, along with materials that provided crucial context for understanding the first cache. The successful preservation of these materials across multiple burial sites demonstrated the sophisticated planning and deep commitment that had gone into the archive project. The third cache has never been found. Despite extensive searches over many decades, it remains somewhere beneath the rebuilt city of Warsaw, a hidden treasure that contains the final thoughts and testimonies of people, who knew they were writing their own epitaphs. The knowledge that these voices are still waiting to be heard adds poignancy to the ongoing search efforts and reminds us that the full story of the Warsaw Ghetto may never be completely known. The transformation of these buried documents into published testimonies and historical analyses fulfilled the archive creators' ultimate goal of ensuring that their voices would be heard by future generations. The materials have been translated into dozens of languages, studied by researchers around the world, and used as source material for books, films, educational programs that keep the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto alive. Achieving this reach and impact, a buried archive accomplished exactly what its creators had hoped for. It transformed their local tragedy into a universal lesson about human resilience, dignity, and the power of truth to outlast the forces that tried to destroy it. Just beyond the walls that contained such immense suffering and heroic resistance, another world continued to exist, a world of comfortable apartments, well-stocked pantries, and evening entertainments that seemed to belong to an entirely different universe than the one we have been exploring. Picture a scene that encapsulates the moral chasm that defined occupied Warsaw. A Nazi officer standing on a balcony overlooking the smoldering ruins of the ghetto, a crystal wine glass in his hand, engaging in pleasant conversation about music, literature, or his family back in Germany, while the acrid smoke of burning buildings drifts past his face. This was not fiction, but reality. The stark juxtaposition of comfort and catastrophe that defined the geography of moral choice in occupied Poland. The apartments, commandeered by German officials and their collaborators, were often located in the most desirable neighborhoods of Warsaw, buildings that had been confiscated from their original owners and converted into oases of European bourgeois comfort in the midst of a city under siege. These residences were furnished with items looted from across occupied Europe, Persian rugs from Jewish homes in Vienna, silverware from aristocratic families in Prague, paintings from museums in Amsterdam. The irony was intentional and complete. The perpetrators of systematic destruction surrounded themselves with the cultural treasures of the civilizations they were destroying. Imagine walking through one of these apartments in the evening, when the day's work of persecution and murder was finished, and the officers had returned to their private quarters. The floors gleamed with fresh polish applied by polished servants who worked in silent resentment. The walls displayed artwork that had been evacuated from homes whose owners had been evacuated to death camps. The dining rooms contained china and crystal that reflected candlelight, while casting shadows that seemed to hold the ghosts of their previous owners. These spaces represented more than mere luxury. They were theaters of denial, where genocide was transformed into administrative routine through the magic of cruel, domestic normalcy. The social rituals that took place in these apartments revealed the psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil while maintaining their sense of being civilized. Cultured human beings. Dinner parties were held where guests discussed philosophy, art, language, and literature, while the sounds of deportation actions echoed from the nearby ghetto. Musical evenings featured performances of Bach and Mozart, played on pianos that had been stolen from families who were no longer alive to hear them. These cultural activities served as moral camouflage, allowing participants to believe that their appreciation for beauty somehow canceled out their participation in ugliness. The servants who worked in these households found themselves in positions of terrible moral complexity, forced to maintain the comfort of people they knew were responsible for the destruction of their community. Polish maids cleaned bloodstains from German uniforms without comment. Cooks prepared elaborate meals using ingredients that were forbidden to their own families. Drivers maintained vehicles that were used to transport people to deportation centers, then polished them carefully for their employers' evening social engagements. These servants became unwilling witnesses to the intimate details of how genocide was planned and implemented by people who otherwise appeared to be ordinary human beings. The conversations that took place in these privileged spaces revealed the intellectual and emotional gymnastics required to reconcile participation in mass murder with self-image as decent, civilized people. Officers discussed their difficult but necessary work in terms that abstracted it from human reality. They spoke of processing rather than killing, relocation rather than deportation to death camps, pacification rather than the destruction of entire communities. This language served as a buffer between their actions and their conscience, allowing them to maintain psychological distance from the human consequences of the religious services held for the German community in occupied Warsaw provided another layer of moral contradiction. As Christian clergy blessed and sanctified actions that violated every principle of human decency and religious teaching. Church services were conducted in buildings that had been confiscated from their original congregations, with sermons that explained how divine providence had chosen the German people for a special mission that required harsh measures against their enemies. These religious justifications provided spiritual comfort to people who might otherwise have been troubled by their participation in systematic evil, transforming murder into martyrdom and theft into divine mandate. The correspondence between these privileged residents and their families back in Germany reveals the mental compartmentalization required to maintain relationships with loved ones while participating in genocide. Letters home described the beautiful architecture of Warsaw, the cultural opportunities available in the occupied city, and the interesting challenges of their administrative work, without mentioning the human cost of their presence there. Photographs sent to family members showed smiling faces and comfortable living situations without including images of the destruction visible just beyond the camera's frame. These communications created parallel realities where the same people existed simultaneously as loving family members and as participants in systematic murder. The economic relationships that developed between the privileged occupiers and the subject population created additional layers of moral complexity. German officials purchased services and goods from Polish merchants, desperately needed their business, but morally despised their customers. Social relationships developed between occupiers and occupied that involved genuine personal affection, alongside systematic political oppression. Some German officers developed protective feelings toward specific Polish families while continuing to implement policies that destroyed thousands of other Polish families. These individual relationships created exceptions and contradictions that made the moral landscape even more treacherous for everyone involved. The transformation of ordinary German citizens into participants in genocide was facilitated by their immersion in these comfortable social environments that normalized and domesticated evil. The same person who spent his morning organizing deportation schedules would spend his afternoon playing with his children in a park that had been cleared of its previous users through systematic murder. The woman who processed confiscated property in the morning would spend her evening hosting dinner parties where guests complimented her on the beautiful serving dishes without asking where they had come from. This juxtaposition of intimate humanity and systematic inhumanity created a moral vertigo that made ethical clarity nearly impossible to maintain. The evening of May 16, 1943, the same day that marked the official end of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Brigadier Jürgen Stroop hosted a celebration dinner on the terrace of his commandeered villa overlooking the still smoking ruins of what had once been home to nearly 500,000 people. Picture this scene in all its moral horror: crystal glasses catching the light of flames still flickering among the rubble below, the clink of silverware against fine china mixing with the distant sounds of final gunshots and collapsing buildings. The menu that evening featured delicacies imported from across occupied Europe, French wines, Dutch cheeses, Polish ham, while the ash from burning human habitations settled like gray snow on the white tablecloth. The children of German officials, when they appeared at such gatherings, provided some of the most morally complex moments of the entire occupation experience. These young people had been raised in an environment where systematic persecution was presented as normal. Administrative work, where their comfortable lives were built on the systematic destruction of other families. They played games in gardens that had been confiscated from murdered families, attended birthday parties where the entertainment was provided by musicians forced to perform under threat of deportation, and grew up believing that their privileged position was a natural result of their racial superiority rather than a consequence of systematic theft and murder. The entertainment provided at these social gatherings often featured performances by Polish and Jewish artists who had been pressed into service to provide cultural refinement for their oppressors. Musicians who had lost their own families in deportation actions were required to play cheerful melodies for the people responsible for those deportations. Actors who had watched their theaters closed and their colleagues disappeared were forced to perform comedy sketches for audiences who had implemented the policies that destroyed their profession. These performances created a grotesque theater of power, where culture became a tool of humiliation rather than enlightenment. The photographic, cute documentation that survives from these social events provides a chilling record of how genocide was integrated into ordinary social life. Family albums contain images of smiling German officials posing with their children in front of burning buildings, of dinner parties held on terraces overlooking destruction zones, of birthday celebrations, and wedding anniversaries conducted in apartments filled with stolen property. These photographs were taken and preserved by people who apparently saw nothing shameful in documenting their participation in systematic evil. suggesting a complete moral inversion where persecution became a source of pride rather than shame. The economic discussions that took place at these social gatherings revealed the systematic nature of the theft and exploitation that accompanied the political persecution. German officials discussed the redistribution of confiscated property with the same casual interest they might show in any real estate transaction. They compared the value of apartments, businesses, and personal possessions that had been seized from deported families, sometimes arguing over who would receive which items as rewards for their participation in the deportation process. These conversations transformed theft into administrative procedure, making it appear routine and bureaucratic rather than criminal and immoral. The religious justifications that were offered for these policies created another layer of moral confusion, as Christian clergy provided theological frameworks that presented persecution as divine mandate rather than human choice. Sermons were preached that explained how God had chosen the German people for a special mission that required harsh measures against their enemies. Grace was said over meals that had been prepared with food stolen from the homes of murdered families. Religious holidays were celebrated in buildings that had been confiscated from their original congregations, with prayers offered for the success of military operations that included the systematic murder of civilian populations. The correspondence between these dinner party guests and their families back in Germany provides insight into the psychological compartmentalization required to maintain normal human relationships while participating in genocide. Letters home described the beautiful spring weather in Warsaw, the cultural opportunities available in the occupied city, and the satisfying nature of their important administrative work, without mentioning the human cost of their presence there. Photographs sent to loved ones showed smiling faces in comfortable living situations, without including images of the destruction visible beyond the camera's frame. The medical professionals who attended these social gatherings brought their own particular form of moral contradiction to the proceedings. Doctors who had participated in the selection of victims for deportation discussed public health measures with colleagues who were implementing policies designed to destroy public health in targeted populations. Physicians who had refused medical care to dying patients based on their racial classification shared professional gossip with colleagues who maintained hospitals that were forbidden to treat certain categories of human beings. These conversations created a parallel medical reality where healing and harming coexisted without apparent cognitive dissonance. The transformation of Warsaw's cultural institutions to serve the entertainment needs of the occupying forces created additional layers of moral complexity. Concert halls that had once featured Polish and Jewish performers now hosted exclusively German artists performing for exclusively German audiences. Museums that had once preserved Polish cultural heritage now displayed exhibits explaining the racial inferiority of the Polish people and the historical inevitability of German domination. Libraries that had once served the educational needs of the entire population now restricted access based on racial classification and political loyalty. The legacy of these dinner parties and social gatherings extended far beyond their immediate participants, creating networks of complicity and shared knowledge that would shape post-war politics in memory for decades to come. The people who attended these events became bound together by their shared participation in genocide, creating bonds of mutual dependence and mutual vulnerability that would influence their behavior long after the war ended. Date shared about each other's actions created a community of complicity that would work together to obscure, deny, and minimize their wartime activities when they faced post-war accountability. When the sun rose over Warsaw on May 17, 1943, it illuminated a city that had been fundamentally transformed, not just physically, but morally. The smoldering ruins of the ghetto stood as a monument to both human evil and human resistance, while in the undamaged neighborhoods beyond, people who had witnessed or participated in systematic persecution began the long process of deciding how they would remember what they had seen and done. The morning light revealed not just the destruction of buildings, but the destruction of certainties about human nature, civilization, and moral progress that had defined European self-understanding for centuries. In the comfortable apartments where German officials had entertained themselves throughout the occupation, the morning brought a different kind of reckoning. As they read reports of the uprisings and, over breakfast served on stolen china, many began to understand that their participation in genocide would not remain forever hidden behind the bureaucratic language and social rituals that had made it seem routine. The same people who had spent months discussing deportation schedules as if they were shipping manifests now faced the possibility that future generations might judge their actions with moral clarity that their contemporary circumstances had obscured. The Polish servants who had maintained these households of privilege throughout the occupation found themselves in possession of knowledge that would burden them for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the intimate details of how genocide was planned and implemented by people who otherwise appeared to be ordinary human beings. They had served meals to individuals who spent their days organizing mass murder, had cleaned clothes, stained with the evidence of systematic persecution, had listened to conversations that revealed the bureaucratic machinery of destruction. This knowledge created a particular form of survivor's burden. They would carry the memory of complicity long after the perpetrators had fled or been captured. The children who had grown up during the occupation, both Polish and German, faced the challenge of integrating experiences that defied normal psychological development. Polish children had learned that authority figures could not be trusted, that security was always temporary, and that human beings were capable of casual cruelty that exceeded their worst nightmares. German children had been raised to believe that systematic persecution was normal administrative work and that their comfortable lives were natural rights rather than the products of theft and murder. Both groups would carry these early lessons into adulthood, shaping their understanding of human nature and social responsibility for decades to come. The physical reconstruction of Warsaw began almost immediately after the war's end, but the moral reconstruction proved far more complex and enduring. The neighborhoods that had housed the ghetto were rebuilt with new buildings and new residents, yet the memory of what had happened there could not be paved over or constructed away. Survivors who returned to the city found themselves walking through streets where every corner held memories of friends, family members, and neighbors who had disappeared into the machinery of systematic destruction. The rebuilt city looked modern and hopeful, yet it stood on foundations that included the caches of 500,000 murdered people. The documentation projects that had been undertaken during the occupation, particularly the Wang Shabbat archive, began to fulfill their creators' hopes as the buried materials were discovered and translated into testimonies that could speak to future generations. These voices from the underground provided counter-narratives to the official accounts of the occupation, revealing the human reality behind statistics and administrative records. The process of uncovering and interpreting these materials became a form of archaeological excavation of memory, bringing to light experiences that the perpetrators had hoped would remain forever buried. The international response to the revelation of what had happened in occupied Poland reflected both genuine horror and considerable discomfort with the implications of systematic persecution for understanding human nature and civilizational progress. The world had to grapple with evidence that genocide could be implemented by educated, cultured people using the tools of modern bureaucracy and technology. The comfortable belief that civilization represented moral progress was shattered by evidence that the most advanced societies could organize and implement systematic murder with industrial efficiency. The trials and investigations that followed the war's end revealed the complex web of individual choices and institutional structures that had made genocide possible. The people who had attended dinner parties while their neighbors were being murdered found themselves faced with legal and moral accountability that their wartime circumstances had seemed to make irrelevant. the psychological mechanisms that had allowed them to maintain normal social lives while participating in systematic evil compartmentalization, bureaucratic abstraction, cultural rationalization, were exposed and examined by judges and squamed by judges and squamed. Historians trying to understand how ordinary people became perpetrators of extraordinary crimes. The educational challenge posed by these experiences continues to shape how societies teach young people about human nature, moral responsibility, and the fragility of civilized values. The history of occupied Poland demonstrated that systematic persecution could happen in modern, educated societies with strong cultural traditions and sophisticated legal institutions. This knowledge created an obligation to prepare future generations to recognize and resist the early stages of systematic persecution before they developed into full-scale genocide. The memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising became a symbol of resistance that inspired liberation movements around the world. Yet, it also carried the burden of representing a community that had been almost completely destroyed. The heroism of the fighters who chose to die on their feet rather than live on their knees provided inspiration for people facing oppression in other times and places. Yet it also served as a reminder of how much human potential had been lost through systematic persecution. The uprising succeeded in its goal of transforming victimization into resistance. Yet it could not restore the vibrant community that had been destroyed. The psychological legacy of the occupation extended far beyond its immediate victims and perpetrators, creating patterns of trauma and memory that would influence Polish, German, and Jewish communities for generations. Children and grandchildren of survivors carried inherited memories of experiences they had never directly lived through yet, which shaped their understanding of human nature and social trust. Children and grandchildren of perpetrators carried inherited guilt and shame for actions they had not personally committed yet, which challenged their understanding of their own moral heritage. The philosophical questions raised by the occupation of Poland continue to challenge contemporary understanding of human nature, moral progress, and social responsibility. How could systematic persecution happen in a civilized society? What individual and institutional factors made genocide possible? How should societies prepare themselves to recognize and resist the early stages of systematic persecution? These questions have no easy answers, yet they must be confronted by each generation that hopes to prevent the repetition of such systematic evil. The transformation of Warsaw from a city of systematic persecution into a modern European capital represents both the possibility of renewal and the persistence of memory. The rebuilt neighborhoods contain no visible traces of the ghetto walls, yet the memory of what happened within those walls continues to shape how the city understands itself and its responsibilities to future generations. The comfortable apartments where German officials once entertained themselves are now occupied by new residents who may be unaware of their building's history. Yet, that history remains part of the moral landscape that all residents inherit. As we finish our journey through this dark chapter of human history, we return to the present with a deeper understanding of both human capacity for evil and human capacity for resistance. The morning light that revealed the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto also illuminated the truth that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose dignity over degradation, courage over compliance, and hope over despair. These choices, made by individuals facing impossible circumstances, become part of the permanent record of human possibility that challenges and inspires every subsequent generation. In remembering their stories, we honor their memory and accept our responsibility to ensure that such systematic evil never again finds fertile ground in human society.